Saint Benedict, the saint who fought against demons in a cave and founded a rule that saved Europe. Saint Benedict was attacked by demons for 3 years in an isolated cave and survived. A man who abandoned wealth and prestige to live in the most extreme solitude, only to become a leader of thousands. His rule of life was so powerful that it became the foundation that sustained European civilization when the Roman Empire completely collapsed. What the Church doesn't tell about the prophecies he made, predicting the destruction of entire monasteries. A saint who faced terrible temptations and defeated the enemy with a simple cross. The man who was poisoned twice by jealous monks and miraculously survived both attempts. Saint Benedict of Nursia, the patriarch that Europe forgot, but whose secret work continues shaping the world to this day. The story you never heard about the saint who brought light to the darkness of the Middle Ages, and whose teachings can transform your life now. In the year 480, while the once glorious Western Roman Empire was crumbling into ruins, a child destined to bring light in dark times was born in Nursia, in the mountains of Italian Umbria. Benedict came into the world in a noble and wealthy family, son of a Roman aristocrat during a period of profound crisis. The world that received him was unrecognizable. The barbarians had deposed the last emperor just 4 years earlier, and the civilization that had dominated the world for 1,000 years was collapsing. The young Benedict grew up among privileges, but from an early age demonstrated an unusual spiritual sensitivity. While other noble children delighted in games and amusements, he observed, with penetrating and thoughtful eyes, the suffering of the people and the moral decay that was spreading everywhere. His twin sister, Scholastica, shared this same spiritual inclination, as if both had come into the world with a divine mission already inscribed in their souls. His parents, perceiving their son's sharp intelligence, sent him to Rome to complete his studies. The Eternal City, although fallen from its former glory, was still the center of knowledge. There, Benedict studied rhetoric, philosophy, and law, the classical education of every young Roman patrician. But what he saw in the city disturbed him deeply. Rome, once the center of the civilized world, was now immersed in vice, corruption, and moral decay. The students, his companions, surrendered themselves to worldly pleasures while true knowledge languished. The streets, once marked by order and majesty, now reflected the chaos of a civilization on the brink of the abyss. Benedict walked through those streets like a foreigner, a silent observer of a world that was dying without realizing it. It was during a particularly unruly celebration that something awakened in young Benedict. While his colleagues indulged in excesses, he remained apart, observing with growing horror the human degradation. That night, under Rome's starry sky, he had an experience that would change the course of his life forever. An inner voice, clear as crystal, asking him, "Is this the world to which you belong?" At 20, seized by an unwavering resolution, Benedict did what seemed unthinkable for a young man of his position. He abandoned his studies, renounced his family inheritance, and turned his back on the bright future that awaited him. The decision shocked his family and scandalized Roman society. How could a young man of such noble lineage and promising future abandon everything? Accompanied only by his former nurse, a faithful servant who could not bear to see the young master depart alone, Benedict left Rome in search of solitude and silence. His first stop was in Fide, present-day Aphile, a small village in the mountains. There he performed his first miracle. He repaired a clay pot that his nurse had accidentally broken, solely with the power of his prayer. The episode, seemingly simple, was a harbinger of the spiritual power that dwelled in that young man. But the fame of this small miracle spread quickly, attracting the curious and admirers. Benedict, uncomfortable with the unwanted attention, understood that he needed even more radical isolation. He then bid farewell to his nurse and departed alone, entering the wild mountains in search of a refuge where he could surrender himself entirely to contemplation and prayer. Destiny led him to a place that would change not only his life, but the course of Western history. A remote and almost inaccessible gorge near Subiaco, about 40 miles from Rome. There, in the depths of a mountainous and inhospitable region, Benedict met a monk named Romanus, who lived as a hermit. Impressed by the young man's determination, Romanus gave him the monastic habit, a simple tunic of skin, and showed him an almost inaccessible cave in the cliff. This cave, which would later be known as the Sacro Spico Sacred Cave, became the setting for one of the most intense spiritual battles in Christian history. There, completely isolated from the world, fed only by the bread that the monk Romanus lowered to him by a rope at regular intervals, Benedict began his journey to the heart of God and to the heart of the darkness that inhabited his own being. No one could imagine that young aristocrat, hidden in a wild cave, was about to wage a battle that would echo through the centuries. No one could predict that from that extreme isolation would be born a light capable of illuminating all of Europe plunged into the darkness of civilizational collapse. The young man whom Rome rejected was about to become the spiritual father of a new civilization. The silence of the Subiaco cave was oppressive. For 3 years, Benedict remained there, isolated from the world, in a solitude so deep that few could endure. His only connection with humanity was the monk Romanus, who periodically lowered bread on a rope, announcing his arrival with the sound of a small bell. The rest of the time, Benedict was alone, or so it seemed. For in truth, that grotto became the battlefield for a spiritual war of terrifying proportions. The ancient monastic tales, preserved by Saint Gregory the Great, reveal that Benedict was repeatedly attacked by demonic forces. These entities, perceiving the spiritual potential of that young man, launched against him their entire arsenal of temptations and torments. The first great trial came in the form of the temptation of the flesh. A memory of a beautiful woman he had met in Rome began to torment him day and night. The image became increasingly vivid, more seductive, more irresistible. The demons made her appear before him, calling him, inviting him to abandon his spiritual quest. The desire grew so intensely that Benedict almost left his cave to return to Rome. In a moment of desperate clarity, he understood that he was being attacked. In an extreme gesture that demonstrated his iron determination, Benedict stripped off his garments and threw himself naked among briars and nettles, rolling his body over the thorns until he was completely wounded and bleeding. The extreme physical pain overcame the temptation of the flesh, and the vision of the woman disappeared. According to tradition, he would never again be tempted in this way. The wound of the body had healed a deeper wound of the soul. But the attacks were only beginning. One night, a black raven appeared at the entrance of the cave, cawing incessantly, preventing him from praying or sleeping. The bird remained there for hours, its eyes glowing in the darkness like embers. Benedict, recognizing another attack, made the sign of the cross, and the raven transformed into a cloud of black smoke that dissipated into the darkness. On another occasion, Benedict heard human voices calling his name from outside the cave. They were familiar voices, his parents, childhood friends, fellow students, begging him to return, saying they were sick or dying and needed him. After an entire night resisting the impulse to leave his refuge, he discovered they were only demonic illusions. The most violent attack occurred when the demons manifested physically, assuming monstrous forms and trying to attack him. Benedict later reported having seen half-human, half-animal creatures with horns and claws that tried to drag him out of the cave. Brandishing his cross, he faced them while reciting the Psalms until the apparitions dissipated. During these 3 years of intense spiritual battle, something extraordinary was happening inside that young man. Each temptation overcome, each attack repelled strengthened his spirit. Each night of torment was followed by a morning of deeper spiritual clarity. Benedict was being forged in the fire of adversity, transforming into the man that God had planned him to be. Meanwhile, completely unaware of Benedict, shepherds from the mountains occasionally spotted a strange figure in the region. Once, one of them approached the cave and, to his astonishment, found the young monk dressed in animal skins. Initially frightened, thinking it was a wild animal, the shepherd soon recognized a human being. Intrigued by the presence of that strange hermit, he began to visit Benedict regularly, bringing him food. The news of the presence of a holy man in the mountains spread quickly. Soon, other shepherds began to visit Benedict, seeking advice and blessings. Little by little, word spread throughout the region, and people from nearby villages began to make pilgrimages to the cave, seeking one who seemed to have acquired supernatural wisdom. It was during this period that Benedict's first miracles began to be reported. It was said that he had healed a shepherd of a serious wound with just a prayer, that he predicted a devastating storm, saving an entire village, that he freed a child possessed by evil spirits. Each new account increased his fame for holiness. Ironically, while fighting his inner battles against demons, Benedict was unknowingly becoming a light for the outside world. The man who sought absolute isolation was attracting followers. The young man who had fled Rome to escape its decadence was now slowly being prepared for a much greater mission than he had ever imagined. At the end of these 3 years of extreme trial, the transformation was complete. Benedict was no longer the young Roman nobleman who had abandoned his studies in search of inner peace. He had become an experienced spiritual warrior, a man whose soul had been tested in the crucible of suffering and emerged victorious. He was ready for the next chapter of his life, a chapter that would take him out of his solitude and place him at the center of a spiritual revolution that would forever change the face of Europe. Benedict's fame as a holy man spread like wildfire. His refuge in the cave was now a place of pilgrimage, and his life of isolation was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. It was then that something unexpected happened. The monks of a nearby monastery in Vicovaro, whose abbot had just died, came to implore Benedict to take leadership of their community. Benedict initially refused. He knew the reputation of those monks, undisciplined, worldly, more interested in earthly comforts than in spiritual pursuit. "My habits are very different from yours," he warned. "We will never be able to live together." But the monks insisted, promising obedience and reform. Reluctantly, Benedict accepted the call, leaving his beloved cave to assume the role of abbot. As he had predicted, the monks soon regretted their choice. The rigorous discipline imposed by Benedict was too much for those who were accustomed to a superficial religious life. The tension grew until some monks made a shocking decision. They decided to poison their new abbot. They prepared a cup of wine mixed with deadly poison and offered it during the meal. Following his custom, Benedict made the sign of the cross over the cup before drinking. At that instant, the cup exploded into 1,000 pieces, spilling the poisoned wine on the floor. Benedict calmly looked at the conspiring monks and said, "May God forgive you, brothers. I warned you that our paths were different." After this episode, Benedict returned to the mountains of Subiaco, but no longer to live in isolation. Disciples began to gather around him, men who sought his spiritual guidance and wished to live under his direction. Gradually, Benedict established 12 small monasteries in the region, each with 12 monks and a superior, all under his general supervision. A new model of monastic life was being born. During this period, the miracles attributed to Benedict multiplied. Once, a young monk named Placidus fell into a lake while collecting water. The waters were deep and the current strong. The boy was drowning. Benedict, who was in his cell at some distance, had a vision of the danger. He called another monk, Maurus, and ordered him to run to save Placidus. Blessing him quickly, he sent him on a rescue mission. Maurus ran to the lake and, in his fervor to obey, walked on the waters without realizing it, reached Placidus, and brought him back to the shore. Only when they were already on solid ground did Maurus look back and understand the miracle that had just happened. He had walked on water like St. Peter. When the monks attributed the feat to Benedict's holiness, he, humbly, attributed it to Maurus's perfect obedience. Another extraordinary miracle happened when a local peasant came to Benedict carrying the body of his small son, who had died from a sudden illness. With a broken heart, the man laid the child's body at the saint's feet and begged for his intervention. Benedict, deeply moved, prostrated himself over the child's body, as the prophet Elisha had done, and prayed intensely for hours. To the astonishment of all present, the boy opened his eyes and returned to life, completely healed. One of the most well-known episodes of this period involves a raven that came daily to receive bread from Benedict's hands. Once, someone sent Benedict a poisoned bread, the second attempt on his life. The saint, with his supernatural perception, recognized the danger and ordered the raven, "Take this bread and carry it where no man can find it." The bird, obeying the order, took the bread in its beak and flew away, returning only hours later. This raven became a frequent symbol in Benedictine iconography. Benedict's ability to read hearts and minds was becoming increasingly evident. A young monk, during the Lenten fast, secretly hid a small bottle of wine, violating the rule. Benedict, being far away, spiritually saw the transgression and told another monk exactly where the bottle was hidden. When confronted, the guilty monk acknowledged his error and repented. On another occasion, a nobleman sent Benedict 2 flasks of wine as a gift, but the messenger hid one of them for himself. When delivering the gift, Benedict thanked him and then calmly said, "Be careful with what is inside the flask you hid. Turn it upside down before drinking." Confused and ashamed, the messenger did as instructed upon returning and discovered that a serpent had hidden inside the flask. Another life saved by Benedict's gift of spiritual vision. The fame of these and other miracles began to attract not only sincere disciples, but also envy and resentment. A local priest named Florentius, consumed by jealousy of Benedict's growing influence, tried to discredit him and even sent poisoned bread as a gift, the same that was carried away by the raven. When his assassination attempts failed, Florentius sent 7 naked young women to dance and behave lasciviously in the monastery garden, hoping to tempt the monks and discredit Benedict. Faced with this relentless persecution, Benedict made a surprising decision. He decided to leave. "It is better to yield to hatred than to cause the brothers to be tempted because of me," he explained. This decision, which might have seemed like a retreat, was actually part of the divine plan, for it would lead Benedict to the place where his greatest work would be accomplished, Monte Cassino. In the year 529, after leaving Subiaco, Benedict headed south with a small group of faithful disciples. Their journey led them to an imposing mountain that dominated the landscape, Monte Cassino, strategically located between Rome and Naples. What they found there shocked even those spiritual men accustomed to difficulties. At the top of the mountain stood an ancient temple dedicated to Apollo, where local peasants still performed pagan sacrifices, despite a century of official Christianization of the empire. Sacred trees surrounded the sanctuary, and obscure rituals were practiced on full moon nights. The region, although nominally Christian, remained deeply rooted in pagan practices that dated back millennia. Benedict saw in this challenge a divine opportunity. Where others saw only danger and spiritual contamination, he perceived a call to transform a center of idolatry into a beacon of Christian light. With unwavering determination, Benedict began to preach to the local inhabitants. His powerful presence, his clear word, and the miracles that accompanied him gradually won the trust of the peasants. With the help of new converts and his monks, Benedict tore down the idol of Apollo, cut down the sacred grove, and on the exact spot where the pagan altar stood, built a chapel dedicated to Saint Martin of Tours. Near this, he erected another chapel in honor of Saint John the Baptist. These 2 figures were chosen purposefully. Martin, the great evangelizer of Gaul, who had destroyed pagan temples, and John the Baptist, the voice crying in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord. The spiritual battle for the mountain was neither easy nor quick. Ancient monastic accounts describe how Benedict faced terrible demonic manifestations during construction. Workers reported hearing strange voices coming from the stones. Tools mysteriously disappeared. Some workers suffered inexplicable accidents. On one particularly dramatic occasion, an enormous stone that was to be used in construction became inexplicably heavy. Several men could not move it. Benedict, recognizing the malignant interference, made the sign of the cross over the stone, which immediately returned to its normal weight. Gradually, a new monastery began to take shape at the mountaintop. No longer small scattered communities as in Subiaco, but a single great abbey that would become the model for all later Benedictine foundations. Monte Cassino was conceived as a city of God, self-sufficient and well-organized, where every aspect of life was harmonized with the divine. It was in this setting, while directing the physical construction of the monastery, that Benedict undertook his most enduring work, the writing of the Benedictine Rule. This document, seemingly simple with its 73 concise chapters, would become one of the most influential texts of Western civilization, serving as a basis not only for monastic life, but also for many secular institutions for centuries. The genius of the rule was in its perfect balance. Unlike earlier monastic rules, which often emphasized extreme austerities, Benedict's was humane, moderate, and psychologically profound. "Nothing harsh, nothing heavy," he wrote, establishing a rhythm of life based on the harmony between prayer, intellectual work, and manual labor. The famous ora et labora, pray and work, that would become the Benedictine motto. The daily journey of the monks was carefully structured around the liturgy of the hours. 8 moments of communal prayer distributed throughout the day and night, creating a constant rhythm of praise that sanctified time. Between these moments of prayer, the monks dedicated themselves to manual work, agriculture, crafts, copying manuscripts, and to lectio divina, the meditative reading of the scriptures and the church fathers. The social organization of the community was equally revolutionary. Although the abbot had absolute authority, he was obliged by the rule to consult all the brothers, for often God reveals to the youngest what is best. This first form of consultative government in the midst of an era of absolute power would plant democratic seeds that would bear fruit centuries later. Benedict established that nothing should be possessed individually. Everything belonged to the community. However, recognizing human frailty, he ensured that all legitimate needs were met. If possible, the monastery should be established in such a way that all necessary things are within it: water, mill, garden, workshops, so that the monks need not wander outside, which is not good for their souls. The Abbey of Monte Cassino quickly became a center of spiritual, intellectual, and material excellence. Peasants learned advanced agricultural techniques from the monks. Young nobles were sent for education. Pilgrims sought healing and counsel. The library and scriptorium, copying room, began to preserve literary treasures of antiquity that would otherwise have been lost forever in the barbarian invasions. Meanwhile, the fame of Benedict's miracles continued to grow. The Gothic king Totila, impressed with reports about the saint, decided to test him. He sent one of his officers wearing royal clothes, pretending to be the king. When the false king arrived, Benedict looked at him fixedly and said, "Take off those clothes, my son. They do not belong to you." The officer, astonished, returned to Totila and reported what had happened. The king then came personally to visit Benedict, prostrating himself in reverence. In this historic meeting, Benedict made 3 shocking prophecies to the powerful barbarian king. "You will enter Rome, cross the sea, reign for 9 years, and die in the 10th. All these predictions were fulfilled exactly as stated, further solidifying Benedict's prophetic reputation. As he aged, Benedict's spiritual powers seemed to intensify. One night, while praying in the monastery tower, he witnessed an extraordinary vision. He saw the entire world gathered as if under a single ray of sunlight. This mystical experience revealed to him the fundamental unity of creation under the divine gaze, a vision that would profoundly shape his understanding of the monastic mission as a service to all humanity. On another equally significant occasion, Benedict witnessed the soul of Saint Germanus, Bishop of Capua, being carried to heaven by angels in a sphere of fire. These mystical visions consolidated his reputation as a man who lived simultaneously in 2 worlds, the visible and the invisible, serving as a bridge between both. Thus, on the top of that mountain that had been a center of pagan worship, there now stood a new civilization in miniature, a model for the world that was to come, when the imperial structure would finally collapse completely. Without knowing it, Benedict was planting seeds that would flourish centuries later, when his monks would become the principal agents of preservation and transmission of culture during the darkest centuries of the Middle Ages. While the Roman Empire completely disintegrated and hordes of invaders swept across Europe, the Benedictine monasteries remained as islands of stability and light in a sea of chaos. Benedict's vision transcended his time and space, creating a system that would not only survive the collapse of ancient civilization, but would become fundamental to the birth of a new order. Benedict's genius was in creating self-sufficient communities that could exist independently of the political structures around them. Each Benedictine monastery functioned as a complete citadel, with gardens, workshops, schools, infirmaries, and libraries. When Roman cities were abandoned and commerce collapsed, these monastic centers preserved not only faith, but also the practical knowledge essential for human civilization. The Benedictine practice of meticulously copying manuscripts saved the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. While entire libraries were burned during the invasions, monks patiently transcribed works of Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, and other classics. Without this silent and persistent work, much of ancient literature, philosophy, and science would have disappeared forever. The Benedictines thus became the unwitting guardians of Western memory. The Rule of Saint Benedict introduced revolutionary concepts to Europe that would transform society. The value of manual labor, considered degrading by the Roman world, was elevated to a form of prayer. Labor est orare, to work is to pray, became a principle that dignified all forms of honest work, planting the seeds of a new work ethic that would eventually drive European economic development. Stability, one of the specific vows of the Benedictines, created permanent communities in times of constant migration. While entire populations moved without direction, the monasteries offered fixed points of reference where civilization could take root. Around these stable communities, villages, and eventually entire cities would develop, establishing new urban centers that would replace the abandoned ancient Roman cities. Benedictine hospitality, all guests should be received as Christ himself, established a safety net for travelers and pilgrims in a time without hotels or public hospitals. The monasteries became centers of social assistance, providing shelter for the homeless, medical care for the sick, and education for young people of all social classes. It was common for monasteries to maintain separate hospitia for the poor, nobles, and pilgrims, attending to the needs of the entire society. The agricultural innovations developed by the Benedictines revolutionized food production in medieval Europe. Crop rotation systems, new irrigation techniques, selective animal breeding, and improved agricultural tools spread from the monasteries to neighboring communities. The famous Trappist beer, monastic wines, and cheeses we know today have their origins in these ancient Benedictine traditions of excellence in food production. In medicine, the monks preserved Greco-Roman knowledge and combined it with traditional wisdom, creating extensive pharmacopoeias and gardens of medicinal herbs. Many monasteries became healing centers, so renowned that nobles and kings traveled great distances to receive treatment. The tradition of caring for the sick, instituted by Benedict, anticipated the development of organized hospital systems by centuries. The consultative democracy practiced within the monasteries, where the abbot had to listen even to the youngest novice, served as a model for more participative forms of government that would emerge centuries later. Monastic assemblies would inspire parliaments. The idea of a community governed by written and consented rules would influence the development of constitutionalism. Perhaps the deepest and least recognized impact of the Benedictine vision lies in the transformation of the conception of time. The division of the day into regular periods of prayer, the canonical hours, created a new rhythm for human existence. The monastery bells, which called the monks to prayer, became the time markers for the entire surrounding society. The first precise measurement of time in the medieval West occurred in Benedictine monasteries, where mechanical clocks were developed to ensure that prayers began at the appropriate moments. The expansion of Benedict's vision across Europe was extraordinary in its speed and reach. Even during his lifetime, new monasteries inspired by Monte Cassino began to appear throughout Italy. After his death, the rule was carried beyond the Alps by missionaries, becoming the standard monastic model throughout Western Europe. From Scandinavia to Sicily, from Ireland to Poland, thousands of Benedictine abbeys flourished, each one a microcosm of the original vision of their founder. The impact of this movement was so profound that when Charlemagne sought to unify his vast empire in the 8th century, He turned to the Benedictine tradition as a unifying force, imposing a rule as the official monastic standard. The abbeys became not only spiritual centers, but also administrative ones, often serving as true regional capitals in areas where secular power was fragmented. Paradoxically, the man who had fled Rome to escape its decline became the spiritual architect of a new civilization that would eventually surpass the glory of the old. The young man who had abandoned classical studies to seek God in the desert would make possible the preservation of those same bodies of knowledge for future generations. It is no exaggeration to say that without Benedict and his rule, the gap between the fall of Rome and the rebirth of European civilization might have been much longer and darker. The flame of knowledge, which nearly extinguished, found shelter in the lamps of Benedictine scriptoria, where it was carefully protected until it could again illuminate the world. To this day, Saint Benedict's legacy remains alive and relevant. The Benedictine rule continues to be observed in monasteries throughout the world, virtually unchanged after 15 centuries, an extraordinary testimony to its timeless wisdom. The balance between work, prayer, and study, between the material and the spiritual, the practical and the contemplative, offers a powerful alternative in our era of extremes and imbalances. The Benedictine principles of stability, continuous conversion, voluntary obedience, and humility present a radical counterpoint to the contemporary culture of constant mobility, immediate self-satisfaction, radical autonomy, and self-assertion. The vision of a community where the common good overcomes individual interest resonates in a special way in a world fragmented by extreme individualisms. Saint Benedict's mark is impressed not only on monasteries and churches, but in the very DNA of Western civilization. His silent influence shapes institutions that often are unaware of their monastic origins. From universities to constitutions, from hospitals to libraries, from unions to agricultural cooperatives, all carry, in some way, the seal of the organizational and spiritual genius of the one whom Europe recognizes as its patron. On March 21st of the year 547, after receiving Holy Communion and surrounded by his monks in prayer, Benedict of Nursia surrendered his soul to the Creator. His twin sister, Saint Scholastica, had departed just a few weeks earlier. According to his own request, he was buried in the same tomb he had prepared for his sister, in the crypt of the Church of Monte Cassino. 15 centuries have passed, and the voice of that young man who fled Rome continues to echo in our time with surprising clarity. The world we live in today, accelerated, noisy, scattered, and constantly connected, seems the exact opposite of the desert that Benedict sought. And perhaps for that very reason, his message has never been as necessary and revolutionary as it is now. What does Saint Benedict offer to the men and women of the 21st century? A wisdom that transcends ages and cultures, speaking directly to the heart of contemporary anxieties. In a world of constant distractions, where attention is fragmented into 1,000 pieces by incessant stimuli, Benedict invites us to silence and full attention. Listen is the first word of his rule, an exhortation not just to hear, but to open the heart. The Benedictine practice of Lectio Divina, slow and meditative reading, presents itself as a radical antidote to our culture of superficial information and rapid content consumption. In a society obsessed with mobility and constant change, where relationships, careers, and even identities become increasingly fluid and transitory, Benedict proposes the revolutionary value of stability. Remaining in the same place, with the same people, facing the same limitations, not as a prison, but as a fertile field for deep growth, where roots can penetrate beyond the surface. We live in a culture that glorifies the extraordinary, the spectacular, and the exceptional. Social media bombards us with images of seemingly perfect lives and grandiose achievements. Against this current, Benedict presents the sanctification of the ordinary, the discovery of the sacred in everyday life, the transformation of the simplest tasks into acts of love. That in all things God may be glorified. This Benedictine motto invites us to find transcendent meaning in the most mundane gestures. Obedience, perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of Benedictine spirituality for modern minds, proposes a liberating paradox. By voluntarily submitting our will to a wisdom greater than our own, we find a form of freedom deeper than the mere absence of restrictions. In a time that idolizes absolute autonomy, this proposal sounds revolutionary. The balance between work, prayer, and rest, the famous Benedictine rhythm, offers a healing alternative to the contemporary extremes of frantic hyperactivity and passive idleness. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, wrote Benedict, but he also warned against excessive work, establishing periods of silence, celebration, and adequate sleep. This wise balance has much to teach a society that oscillates between burnout and existential emptiness. The Benedictine notion of community, with a strong do not oppress the weak, where goods are shared according to each one's need, where decisions are made after listening to everyone, presents a powerful countercultural model in times of extreme individualism and social polarization. Perhaps the deepest lesson that Saint Benedict offers us is his conception of life as a constant quest, a path of continuous conversion. In a world that values immediate results and instant successes, Benedict proposes the patient perseverance of one who knows that true transformation requires time, effort, and surrender to divine grace. The cave of Subiaco, where Benedict fought with his inner demons, invites us to face our own shadows instead of projecting them onto others. The monastery of Monte Cassino, built on the ruins of paganism, inspires us to transform the temples of our former idols into sanctuaries dedicated to the true God. The light kindled by Benedict in those dark years of history continues to shine in our days. His rule, described by himself as a little rule for beginners, proved to be one of the most enduring and transformative documents in human history, not for its complexity or originality, but precisely for its profound simplicity and practical wisdom. In a world that seems increasingly fragmented, confused, and directionless, the figure of Saint Benedict emerges from the past as a reliable guide for the future. His life and teachings offer not only spiritual inspiration, but a practical and time-tested model for rebuilding civilizations from ruins, beginning with the reconstruction of the inner temple of each human heart. Let the final words of this account of the extraordinary life of Saint Benedict be an invitation and a challenge. An invitation to know more deeply this saint who shaped our civilization, and a challenge to apply his timeless wisdom in our own lives, seeking, like him, the balance between action and contemplation, between community and solitude, between work and prayer, between obedience and freedom. For perhaps it is precisely in this balance that we will find, as Benedict found, the path to true peace, the Pax Benedictina, that is not mere absence of conflict, but the full harmony of an integrated life directed toward its highest purpose. And if you have come this far, share this video with someone who needs to know this extraordinary story of Saint Benedict. Leave in the comments which part of this saint's life most impacted you. Would you like to learn more about other saints who transformed the world? What secrets and little-known stories would you like to discover in our next videos? Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you don't miss our next inspiring content. May Saint Benedict intercede for all of us.